We've talked for a long time about nerves, about the nervous system, peripheral, central, tracts, things like that, but the underlying idea of transmission of signals has not been addressed. I've alluded to these funny things called action potentials or nerve impulses. Those are the signals, and this section is devoted to figuring out how the signals propagate and how we determine what signal to send. So far it's been pretty easy. One synapse turns on another nerve, done. But sometimes multiple nerves will converge at the dendrites of one downstream nerve, and they're all going to give signals to that nerve or that neuron. How does the neuron that's downstream know what to do? That's a question we're going to look at in this section after we talk about just the transmission of signals. And I have some fantastic slides from Matt that used to go over in lab that we don't have time for, that we'll talk about hopefully tomorrow. So let's do the highlights before we get into too much hardcore content. Of course, the basic unit of the nervous system, nerves. Neurons, not nerves. Neurons bundled together make nerves. Like muscle, they're excitable. And it's that fundamental principle that allows them to generate and propagate signals. Generate and propagate signals. And for the most part, we know what to expect when we look at a neuron. You've seen examples in lab. Dendrites are incoming. There's a cell body. One axon sends the signal out. Nerves can be unipolar, multipolar, bipolar. You have, I think, a background in that. So we're not going to spend too much time discussing it. What we don't know really yet are some functions of the neuroglia. And we're not going to go into those in depth either, but they are important that we address them in passing to understand at least one important structure. Now the neuroglia we talked about, they outnumber neurons, 25 to 1 in some cases, and they are support structures. And that's a very broad classification. And we're not even looking at all the individual types in the central and peripheral nervous systems. But I do want to draw your attention to, well, first the figure on the right. We have a neuron. It looks pretty much like we expect, but there's a bunch of marshmallows connected to it. And those are myelin sheaths that we haven't talked about. In the central nervous system, the neuroglia that are responsible for making the myelin sheaths are oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes. And they look somewhat like this, but this is not a central nervous system neuron. It still has that wrapping around parts of the axon, but this is a peripheral nervous system neuron where the same exact thing is carried out by Schwann cells, what are called Schwann cells. We'll talk more about it coming up, but essentially this is one cell that wraps around the axon almost 100 times, protects it. The point of myelin is to insulate and protect. And the effect of myelin is that we get super quick transmission of signals. And so white matter in the central nervous system is largely myelinated. We need super quick transmission, generally across long distances, and that's how we achieve it. Myelinated neurons in the peripheral nervous system, same thing. We have Schwann cells wrapping around the axon to allow very quick, long-distance communication. A thought of interest, other neuroglia. We've seen neuroglia before. Ependymal cells are a kind of neuroglia, and we already know what they do. They make the border between the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood, and permit some things through to form the cerebrospinal fluid. Ependymal cells are a type of neuroglia. There's also astrocytes and a bunch of other stuff, but we're not going to really focus on those. I thought it was just cool to bring it up because we've talked about them without articulating it. And we just spent the first half of class talking about, well, first half of class and lab and classes previously talking about the transmission of signals. And here you see neurons set up in that schematic with a sensor, an interneuron that integrates the signal, and an effector that sends the motor potential backwards, or back to the effector, muscle, gland, etc. We don't care so much about multipolar, unipolar, but usually sensory nerves are unipolar. And I think it says it here. Yeah, it does. And then the rest are usually multipolar. Multiple inputs. And this is a diagram of the simplest form of relay. One input is integrated by one neuron and creates one output. But as we'll see, this is much more complicated. You'll notice that each of the axons has this fractal network with what we call end synaptic bulbs that can each connect to a dendrite and can connect to multiple neurons through their dendrites. They don't only connect to one, so you have significant capability to branch out and send signals far afield. And also we have many dendrites that allow the convergence of many signals as well. And I want you to start thinking about this idea because so far our concept of transmission is simple. On or off. In sequence. But it's really more complex. Transmitting a signal is the net effect. It's the sum of all of the signals that arrive at one neuron. And that will become more clear as we go along. Now, I also want to show you a little bit more about myelination, and then we'll pause. And then we'll pause and we'll talk about the overview, the actual conduction of electrical signals later. So we already know myelin sheaths are produced by Schwann cells in the periphery, oligodendrocytes centrally. We really concern ourselves with the peripheral nervous system because it's really the longest distance where we need the fastest transmission. And the Schwann cell is shown here on the left-hand side. You see a myelinated Schwann cell, a myelinated axon, which is myelinated by the wrapping around of a Schwann cell. It generally covers about 1 millimeter of an axon. And so multiple Schwann cells will latch onto one axon. You probably wrap around up to 100 times. And there's a break where one Schwann cell ends and another begins, where the nerve is exposed. And this becomes important in transmitting the nervous signal. It's called a node of Ranvier, the break between two Schwann cells. If you go back to the last gap, the break between two marshmallows on the axon. It might be easier to see it there. So in a myelinated axon, Schwann cell wraps around one axon only, and that's shown on the left. 100 times, covers a millimeter. Schwann cells also help bundle neurons together. And this happens in unmyelinated axons. The difference is you can have up to 20 neurons that are seated within a Schwann cell, but they're not enclosed. They don't have the multiple layers of protective wrapping that insulate them. So they're still effectively exposed. And And you can see that over on the right-hand side. These are still exposed. There's long slits down the length of the Schwann cell. So they're seated, they're together, but they're not myelinated. They're not insulated, they're not protected, they don't have the same capacity for fast nervous transmission. It's actually thought that a lot of the reason you become more coordinated and faster with your reflexes as you grow older is that the myelination of neurons increases as you develop. That, and also you learn how to do things. The motor programming in the cerebellum develops as well, but it's thought to be a pretty large part about becoming more coordinated. Let's leave it there, and we'll get into the overview of electrical signals in class tomorrow. More detail on circuits.